Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So we've been tossing around a really interesting topic between the three of us, the idea of precognitive dreams. And I think everybody relates to this. How many times have we had a dream, we kind of half forget the dream, and then a couple of days or a week later, there's a particular event happens, and we're struck by the fact that we dreamed of encountering that event or that object. How many of us have had precognitive experiences? You're thinking of a friend, perhaps that you haven't spoken to in a long time, and then suddenly the phone rings just as you're thinking about them. So these kinds of precognitive events can happen to everyone, and certain personality types seem to generate these experiences frequently. So today we're going to put this on the table and see what we can figure out about this.
Yeah, and some of our listeners may be aware that a little while ago in the fall of 2018, I put out a call for listeners to submit their precognitive dreams. We had a link up on our website for a while, and I posted it on social media in various places, and people sent in a bunch of precognitive dreams. So we have those today, and we'll be sharing some of those and talking a little bit about what this phenomenon is and perhaps also to a certain extent our own experience with it.
Joseph, I know you've had experience with it. I've had experience with it. It's very, very common, I think, for people to have precognitive experiences. And just as you said, Joseph, a dream that only later we feel is precognitive when we come across that situation or person, life event.
Yeah, and sometimes I think that precognitive dreams are, just these little details. It's like you have a dream, and then 2 days later, the details of the situation, you're sitting on a green couch and someone wearing a red coat walks in or something. It doesn't feel very important, but you recognize that very same thing occurred in the dream. Has that ever happened to either of you?
It certainly has. I'm thinking of a time that I picked up a newspaper that had something in it that struck me as unusual, and yet it was very mundane and pedestrian. And somebody walked in and said, it was on the back page in the ads. I had been bored on the subway and looked at it. Person walked in and had absolutely quoting and living through that very random little experience in the newspaper. So I think there are these meaningful coincidences that are a kind of foreknowledge of things to come. And I think our sort of psychic antenna, like radio waves, pick up all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's one of the dreams that was sent to us when we called for precognitive dreams kind of has that quality to it. It seems like the dream had some foreknowledge of a relatively, at least on the face of it, unimportant detail. And so maybe I'll just start by reading this dream. I had a dream that I was at a Subway sandwich shop and I was buying a $5 footlong. When I was checking out, the person at the register said my total was $11.29. I ended up not buying the sandwich and left the restaurant. That was the end of the dream. The very next day, my friends and I were playing a game called What Do You Meme? And this was my first time ever playing the game. There are 250 pictures and 250 random captions, and the point of the game is to give a picture a caption. I chose 5 caption cards at random, and the very first card I chose was captioned, "When your $5 footlong Subway sandwich turns out to be $11.29. Mind you, there were 250 cards for me to choose from, and that's the very first one I picked. So that's interesting.
I can just imagine how delighted and astounded that person was in that second,
Yeah.
And it creates a feeling in the room when those moments happen that the universe is larger and more mysterious than we had thought a moment ago. And that leans into something that Jung valued greatly, which is the relativization of the ego. That we go through life feeling that we're crafting our life definitively by our decisions and our willpower. And then every once in a while, something happens which is rather miraculous or magical, which also tells us that there are other forces, other elements in the universe that show up that are not in our control and that we have to make room for. And that triggers or supports a kind of psychological expansion.
That's a great way of putting it.
We are set within a larger context. Some of it is the connection to our own unconscious, which goes beyond the personal unconscious of your experiences into something that is much larger and mysteriously part of the whole world. We are set within a larger context, and I'm repeating myself because it's hard to take in experientially, I think. It's hard for us to remember. We automatically go back to our egos and our to-do list and work life and errands we have to run and the kids we have to pick up and so on. And these things remind us we're set within a larger context. I'm just rephrasing your statement, Joseph, about the relativization of the ego.
Yes, if we imagine that this psyche is a landscape, which is something I've mentioned before, and that the ego, which is the conscious part of ourselves, is just one factor, is just one image on the landscape, and that this landscape is populated with all kinds of other psychological and spiritual factors. But even beyond that, the entire landscape exists in a kind of fluidic medium, which touches all the various points of the landscape and extends beyond into the landscape of other people's psyches and even into objects themselves. And the ancient alchemists called this the Prima Materia, that there is a single metaphorical substance out of which all things are shaped and which is in continuous relationship to its manifestations throughout the universe. So, on an unconscious level, we are connected to all points in space, is the theory around this. And although we can entertain that philosophically, when we have these precognitive moments, we're experiencing the reality of that, which I think changes us in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another way to think about this is the collective unconscious, which is sort of the rhizome that connects us all. And perhaps when we have a precognitive dream, we've tapped into that substrate and we're sort of drinking from that universal well. I'm aware that oftentimes death or birth, both of those can be the occasion for precognitive dreams. People not infrequently I've heard some remarkable dreams that people have had either immediately before a loved one dies, or perhaps they're separated from a beloved by, thousands of miles, and they have a dream at the moment of the person's death. And in fact, someone sent us such a dream. I'm just going to read this dream that was sent to us. Approximately 30 years ago, I had a dream. This dream haunts me to this day. I was 21 or so, and my brother 19. He left for active duty in the Army. For a week or so, I had very odd, vivid dreams regarding him. The most prevailing theme of the dreams were death. The final dream of that time period was me opening my apartment door, the person knocking fell through my doorway holding their face, writhing in pain, and having short, dark hair. Moments later, more knocking began. I called through the closed door, requesting to know who it was. It was my brother trying to enter with a gun. I held the door closed while looking over my shoulder at the individual squirming in pain on the floor, asking if he or she were okay. This dream occurred in March of that year. Later in that same year in August, we planned a trip out of town, so I thought I would make contact with a friend in that area to possibly meet at some point to catch up on things. I called her number, her husband answered. I asked to speak with her, and her husband remained silent for a moment. He then stated that this woman had died in March of a suicide. She had had short dark hair, as the person did in the dream. A gun was involved in both her suicide as well as my dream. And the dream occurred in March, the month she killed herself. And so that this dream had occurred a long time ago. And Joseph, as you're saying, it has continued to haunt the person. So it's this sense that it does change us to have an experience like this.
It does. It changes how we feel about everything, especially with this dreamer being able to write it down and reflect on it. In this kind of a dream, I also feel that there are things that we know about each other that are gestating secretly in the personal unconscious mind. For instance, I might wonder if this person had perceived in that extremely subtle way that his friend was in fact at risk for suicide, that the friend was gestating a feeling, an energy was beginning to build. Now, the dreamer may have never considered that on a conscious level, but the unconscious mind was already picking up on it and constellating this possibility, this image of the suicide, which then, for very mysterious reasons, breaks through into the conscious mind through the dream, and then it is confirmed, sadly, in the outer event. So it also speaks to the tremendous sensitivity that we have to each other and the indescribable, nuanced way that we, in fact, are communicating to each other about what we're gestating in the soul.
Yes, the way that intuition, for example, just picks up on all of this information and stores it in the unconscious, that the consciousness has no awareness of. So there's all this information that we're kind of sitting on top of. I think that can also happen with the body, like that we're reading information from our own body state. And so sometimes people have dreams about, that seem precognitive about their state of illness or health.
I think we are connected with each other, the world, and ourselves in so many ways that are unconscious that they seem to be mysterious. It's like, oh my gosh, in this dream that you just read, Lisa, of when the person discovers that there was indeed a suicide at the same time as this dream, there's this sense of, oh my gosh, there's a real aha moment of something mysterious is operating. And what we might say is that the unconscious, like your image of the rhizome, a plant that has many, many underground connections, is really very apt. We're connected in many, many ways. And when they break through into consciousness, we're surprised, appropriately surprised.
And I think with that surprise, particularly in this dream, that we can have, unfairly to ourselves, a feeling of guilt. That I had this dream, I had a hunch, I had a feeling my friend was at risk, then it's confirmed. So what is my responsibility in this circumstance relative to these precognitive impressions? I've had clients bemoan this kind of moment. And how I like to reassure people is that the self is more than capable of communicating definitive directions to the dreamer if that's what was required. And our ability to become aware of nuanced information does not mean that we are destined to intervene or necessarily hold responsibility about these outcomes, that there are larger forces in play.
Yes. And in the moment, we do not always know that this is a precognitive dream. It could be, a tendency to concretize something that we first need to consider symbolically and personally as an image maybe from our own unconscious. And only later we may know that this is something that was actually going to happen to someone in the external world.
I think, Joseph, you raise a really good point that because some dreams are precognitive, it is this spooky feeling that what if we find out something and then what do we do with it? And I like your way of framing it, that it really doesn't make us responsible. I do have a dream that I suppose you could say was somewhat precognitive, that I actually made me stop in my tracks and reevaluate a course of action, and it sort of saved my butt. So maybe I'll talk about that. It was when I was taking the propadoidicum, which are the exams that you have to sit for in training. And I had passed all the exams. The only exam I had yet to pass was the dream exam, which is notoriously difficult. So I was very anxious for it. And I looked at the schedule and I saw that the exam was going to be, say, at 3:00 or something. And so I sort of planned out my whole day, that I was, going to get up and I was going to study, and then maybe I was going to do yoga. I had this whole plan for my day, and then I was going to head over to take the exam. And of course, I was paying attention to my dreams. The dream was something like this. There is a children's shoe sale at a discount shoe store, and I arrived too late and all of the good pairs are gone. And so I woke up in the morning and thought, why that dream? What on earth? And I was thinking about sort of getting there too late. And that made me think, let me double check the time of the exam. And the exam wasn't at 3, it was at 1.
Whoa.
Oh, God, what a save.
Yes, and
I know. The other thing that I thought was neat about the dream is that the Psyche was also telling me, the Psyche obviously didn't want me to miss the exam, but it also sort of indicated that I had sort of overvalued the exam, because the Psyche was here portraying it as a discount children's shoe sale.
That's really lovely. And there are times, I think, precognitively when that happens. And this time it was, as Joseph said, a real save. I've had a precognitive dream too. I had a whole series of dreams when I was pregnant.
Oh, Deb, I just love these dreams. I was hoping you were going to share these.
I would have this dream about once a month or once every 6 weeks or so. And in the dreams, I suddenly realize, I'm about to give birth. I casually find an available place to lie down, a table, a couch, a picnic blanket. I give birth quickly without any effort or pain. And 2 toddlers, a boy and a girl, run around the table, the couch, or the picnic blanket, joyfully yelling, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy."
So funny.
I was pregnant with twins, as it turned out, up until my 7th month, and it had not been diagnosed or determined. And they couldn't tell what the sex of the babies would be, and I had a boy and a girl.
So just to clarify, you had no idea you were pregnant with twins when you had these dreams.
Correct. I had no idea. They would listen for a heartbeat. They found a heartbeat, and then that was the end of it. And so I sort of discounted many, many years ago. Let me say I would probably not have that attitude today, but I discounted the dreams as silly because that doesn't happen. You don't give birth effortlessly in a nanosecond, and you certainly don't give birth to toddlers who can speak. So these were silly dreams.
Well, they were funny. There's like a little sense of humor in them, isn't there?
They were very funny. What I could appreciate was the joyful tone of the dream, and how joyful these 2 little toddlers were. So when I was 7.5 months pregnant, they finally discovered that my weight gain had not been due to overeating, although I'm so sure I did some of that. But
because you had 2 in there, that's so remarkable. Your Psyche was preparing you,
yes,
for the experience of having twins and a boy and a girl.
Well, I think we're seeing from these dreams and discussion and universal experience how important these precognitive dreams can be. Here's one that I found especially moving from a listener who sent it in. I am an Indigenous Australian woman. I was taken away from my birth mother at the age of 4 months. I was then fostered and adopted by Scandinavian parents at 4 years old. I left home at 18 and pursued a career as a community advocate, married, and have 2 children. The laws changed in Australia when I was 30, so I was able to gain my original birth certificate and some small bits of information about my birth mother. The dream commenced my journey to find my birth family. So here's the dream. The preceding was background. I dreamt of 7 women in the desert, red earth country, in line next to each other with digging sticks. They were all singing a song in language I did not understand. They were digging in unison, searching for yams. I was feeling so serene and full of joy. Then I dreamt of all these older men and women smiling and speaking to me in language I did not understand. They, at the end of the dream, conveyed a sense of urgency, a job I must do. Through my phone calls that day, I found my birth mother and my eldest sister. My mom lived 2 streets from me. Since that day, 27 years ago, I have found all my family. I am at peace. That just brings tears to my eyes and a little choke in my throat.
Yeah, it gave me chills.
A job I must do.
Yeah. The dreams really do carry the wisdom of the ancestors, don't they?
Yes, that's a beautiful way to say it. And there it is. In a way, this dream does not require interpretation or some attempt by ego to figure out cause and effect. It has spoken. And the image of the women and the ancestors is lovely, and her sense of completeness is moving, and we recognize it instantly. We know that. And I think for me, there is that sense of knowing that is the mark of synchronicity or something that is precognitive. We recognize it. We know it already. Christopher Bollas, a psychologist who's written a book by that name, and I love the phrase, speaks about this, of that in the unconscious we know it. It has not been thought. It has not been transferred to the ego and the left brain for language and structure. It is the unthought known. We recognize it and we know it. We know that truth.
That's one of the definitions of faith, that something descends into us from the unconscious and emerges from within us rather than from without. And because it emerges within us, it has a kind of abiding natural authority, that we have faith in it in some fashion. I'm also struck by the synchronicity of her living just 2 streets down from her biological mother. It gives me this feeling of gravitational orbits and that mysterious way in which events are drawn together by a larger force.
Here's a question that comes up, I think, a lot, and I think this conversation kind of calls for us to address this a little bit, is how do we know when we have a dream, whether to understand it symbolically or to wonder if it might be precognitive? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times someone will come in with a dream that has some upsetting content in it, say a death. And I think the first place that many of us go, especially when we're not used to working with dreams symbolically, is we wonder, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that this person's going to die? And a lot of the education that I do with clients working with dreams is to say, well, let's think about what this might be symbolically. And it takes a while to get into that mindset. But then here we are saying, well, yes, but sometimes there is precognition at work. So how do we know when it's one thing and when it's another?
Well, I think my default position, much like as you said, Lisa, is to treat dreams always as symbolic. I mean, there is an impulse in the psyche to want to concretize inner images. that we have to fight against in general. And this is the basis of kind of fundamentalist religions, that images and ideas which should remain alive in that metaphoric world are concretized and in that way robbed of their deeper meaning. So, like you, I tend to want to move the dreamer into symbolic and psychological meaning, and leaving a window open that there could be some outer world confirmation, but we shouldn't become paranoid, or we shouldn't literalize them too quickly. I think of it as rather symptomatic if people come in and frequently want to literalize their dream, and if that is particularly accompanied by intense anxiety. That's usually a concern for me.
Mm-hmm. What do you imagine when you see that?
Well, I imagine that the ego is being swamped by the unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's a collapse of levels.
Mm.
And that can create a lot of unnecessary distress. And usually it calls for people returning to a much more grounded, much more empirical attitude for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way you put that, the collapse of levels. I like that.
And Psyche uses the people in our lives, the places and events, to image things symbolically. People dream often of someone or something that has died or disappeared or ended in some way. And in my experience, the question is, well, what died here? Or a house that burned to the ground, or, something that got flooded. What's going on here symbolically? Psyche has to use, Uncle so-and-so and grandmother so-and-so and other people to image something in the psyche. And it may later turn out that it's confirmed in some way in the external world. And it had internal world meaning in the moment as well. It doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah, and in fact, I was wondering even about the $5 footlong. It's such a kind of charming story in a way, and I would be curious if I were working with that person. Was there also, some kind of inner world significance about that little synchronicity? I think we're sort of probably not giving a very satisfactory answer to the question, how do you know if it's precognitive? And I think probably there is no real answer. I mean, I don't think you always do know. I will say that I had a dream about 15 years ago. It was a long dream, but it ended with this image of my mother being very ill and distressed. And what I remember is that she was in a hospital bed with all kinds of tubes and everything. And just the image was shattering. It was so deeply, deeply distressing. It just really rocked me. And, of course, I was in training at the time and I was in analysis. But I woke up and, the first thing I just had to do was I had to call my mother and say, are you okay? And she said, yeah, I'm fine. And I took it to analysis. And I think I was sort of saying, I wonder if there's something wrong with my mother. And she said, well, no, I think it's symbolic. And she had this sort of symbolic take on it that made sense, but it just didn't really ring for me. The emotional impact of that image did not match with the kind of symbolic significance that was ascribed to it. And so I just didn't know what to do with it. I just held on to it. But, years later, it became obvious that my mother was suffering from dementia. And I became convinced that the real visible onset of the dementia started around the time I had that dream. I mean, I shouldn't say it was visible. It wasn't yet. It's like, well, when did these things start, right? When did it exactly start? No one had really seen signs at the time that I had the dream, but within about 6 months, we did. So I think that dream was precognitive in a meaningful sense.
Yes, the pattern for the dementia was beginning to constellate, perhaps in the mother's psyche, and that there was a way in which you were registering that.
Yeah.
You were feeling something coming together and the natural consequence of where that might lead.
And I will say that the dream prepared me because I did really start thinking about what it would be like to lose my mother or to have her become very infirm as a result of that dream.
I think that brings up a very deep feeling that the unconscious is purposive and the self that regulates these communications is purposive. And we are not randomly giving glimpses into these emerging patterns, but that something is required of us psychospiritually when these things are given. And as you said, to be able to contemplate it and to allow it to prepare you. I think it's a lovely attitude to take relative to these somewhat magical dreams.
So really, I'm thinking that we're talking about this preparation in feeling, Lisa, in the context of your dream of, what would it be like to have this happen to my mother? A kind of a preparatory grief experience that that would be awful. That would be so sad. I would be upset. But it's titrated by the dream of still it's in that symbolic world of the dream that you take to your analyst and process as best, to the extent possible, symbolically and personally, and you held on to it. There's this little place of, but what if? Could it be? Or something isn't quite settled. And so it's a rehearsal in a sense. For the feeling that would come when it was discovered that indeed your mother was ill and would get more ill.
I want to share another dream that was sent in because I feel like it's related here in terms of what you said, Joseph, about the psyche being purposive and sometimes kind of leading us. So this dreamer says, I have had tons of precognitive dreams throughout my life. The past 5 years, they have been happening more. The most recent 2 were after I had my first pregnancy. I miscarried the baby at 12 weeks and was really torn up about it. My partner and I were separating, and I was just overall confused with my entire life at that point and very suicidal. One night, I had a dream of a little boy, maybe 8 or so, and he told me, wait until December. I asked him why, but he would just keep telling me to wait, that it was important, and he promised everything would be okay. I had that dream in September, and it left me with such a feeling that I can't describe. It was very powerful, so I waited for December. Nothing happened. By then, I had somewhat healed from my miscarriage and was doing well living on my own. My partner and I were separated, but still seeing each other, but agreed a relationship wasn't right at the moment. Fast forward to February, and my period was late. So I took a pregnancy test, and it came up negative. I saved it for whatever reason and continued on. A few weeks later, I still don't have my period, which isn't out of the ordinary for me, but I feel weird. I look at the pregnancy test I took a few weeks prior and see the faintest second line. Of course, I cried. I couldn't believe it. When I went in to get my first ultrasound, they told me I conceived sometime in December. It made me smile. I believe that is what the little boy was telling me to wait for. While I was pregnant, I would have dreams of the same little boy. But as I got farther in my pregnancy, he got younger in my dreams. I could see his face and I knew his name and everything. I knew I was having a boy, but asked the ultrasound techs not to tell me because I wanted a gender reveal party. When I was 8 months pregnant, we did the reveal, and just like I had guessed, it was a boy. And when I finally gave birth, he had the same face of the little boy I always saw in my dreams. The same boy who told me to wait until December.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah. So the psyche, she was very suicidal. And the psyche could present this to her as something to be hopeful for.
Right. There is new life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm imagining that if she had been in analysis, part of what might have been discussed is, where in you symbolically is there new life in the image of this dream? And that matters and that's important too. that there is inner life as well as eventually the confirmation of pregnancy and a literal new life. Both are true and both matter.
There's also an archetypal theme in the dream, which she lived out in her life, that in the ancient temples, in the temples of Apollo, right around the winter solstice in December, that all the effigies of Apollo would be taken down and the effigies of Dionysus, the resurrected god, would be put up in preparation for spring, because the energy of spring was associated, Zoe, with the spirit of Dionysus. And Dionysus was often celebrated in his image as an infant, as the divine infant. So we could also interpret the dream as a visitation of Dionysus, who is the god who survives dismemberment and trauma, whose life returns every spring unfailingly, and is also a message to her that she can resurrect from the devastation and losses that she had had. So there are multiple levels at which events are meaningful, and to the unconscious, all the levels are equally valued, that the unconscious mind apparently does not differentiate between inner and outer events.
Yeah. They're sort of true on every level at the same time.
Yes, and Jung commented on this, that as he observed shamanic practices and communities that still resourced shamanic paradigms, that dreams that happened in the community and events in the outer world were all considered equally real. So things are happening on different planes simultaneously. This is also an ancient Hermetic idea that shows up in the popular culture, as above, so below, and as below, so above, but after a different manner. So there is this coordination between the inner life and the outer life, between what we imagine is happening in a spiritual plane and what is happening in our lived life, and some kind of continuity between that if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. If we have a personality that is open to making those connections, because many people may be having precognitive dreams and they don't have a personality that encourages them to remember their dreams or to link them with events later on. But it's something in the individual person that allows them to make these connections.
I'm going back to what you said, Joseph, about many levels of a dream and archetypal influences, external world influences, personal associations, and that what we often want to do is we want to say, well, what do precognitive dreams mean? How can I really kind of count on this? That's the demand of the ego to translate the vast unconscious into its own language and into its own terms. And the part doesn't always know the whole. What we do is hopefully we pay attention and relate to dreams on as many levels as we can. And sometimes it is confirmed by an external world event, as in the case of the dream you just read, Lisa, of having a baby boy, a real infant, to hold in her arms. Sometimes not. We can't always know, and the unconscious doesn't operate according to what the ego would like to have it be.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of times, especially when we're in distress or having to sit with uncertainty, we really want the dreams to be showing us what will happen. We're looking for that guide. But, I mean, another way that I think about it sometimes is that the unconscious kind of poses the questions maybe, but it really, the ego often has to find its answer,
Yes, that there is a special place in this great universal pattern for the consciousness of the ego. Jung talks about this, that the universe needs human beings to bring consciousness to these natural patterns. And so there's a mysterious way in which the dreamers who recognize that they have had a dream which precognitively predicted an event that was happening later in the timeline are participating and contributing to something in the collective itself, the maturation of the collective. And in ancient tribes, the shamans who were able to perceive these secret inner patterns also played pivotal roles and were seen as essential not just for the tribe, but also for keeping the universe itself balanced.
You know, I wanted to share, if it's okay for me to switch tracks here just for a second, something that Jung said about precognitive dreams. He called them prospective dreams. And I've always really liked this framing around it. I don't know that it applies to all of the dreams we've been talking about this hour, but certainly some of them at least. He says, the occurrence of prospective dreams cannot be denied. It would be wrong to call them prophetic because at bottom, they are no more prophetic than a medical diagnosis or a weather forecast. They are merely an anticipatory combination of probabilities which may coincide with the actual behavior of things, but need not necessarily agree in every detail. So I'm thinking about my dream about the shoe sale, for example, or Joseph, your point about the dreamer that had the suicide, that it's like the unconscious is picking all this up, just like the meteorologists have access to all this information about the dew point and, the weather systems that are developing offshore. And they can kind of run these models and come up with probabilities about what's going to be happening out of the sky in 3 days' time. It's like our unconscious is kind of doing its own modeling based on all this information.
Which then allows us to think that these extraordinary moments of precognition are natural,
yes,
and are normal, and that perhaps because of modern culture, we have transitioned away from these intuitive gifts and attunements to the unconscious. So we are, as modern people, the anomaly. It's strange that we find these things strange, but that perhaps if we were more authentic and connected into what's natural about being human, that these things might feel rather ordinary. And in that way, perhaps a little more dependable in terms of giving us information about how to navigate life.
And I wonder if this would be a good place to leave precognitive dreams behind and switch over to a rather more ordinary dream, if there is such a thing as an ordinary dream.
Let's do it. Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
This dreamer is a female, and she is 43 years old, and she works as an education manager. And here's the dream. I was standing in front of a house, my house, although it did not resemble my actual house. It was the first time I had been round the front of the house, as usually I would enter via the back door. I had run out of space in my back garden for more plants, and so I was excited to discover all this space at the front of the house for planting. However, all of the available planting space was in the shade or under cover of some sort. There was a nice area right in front of the house, but it sloped downwards toward the house, so it would be tricky to plant there. In addition, I thought that area was too close to the house to plant a tree, in case it interfered with the foundations. Just next to this sloping ground, I noticed that at the point where the sunshine did actually reach the ground, some beautiful bluebells were growing. The main feelings in the dream She says, this felt like a beautiful and positive oasis in the midst of a series of upsetting dreams. It felt exciting to discover the front of the house, and I was happy that I now had space to put more plants. Though it slightly detracted from the excitement to find out that the planting areas were in the shade, this didn't feel upsetting or like a disaster. Discovering the bluebell in the sunlight felt like a wonderful and beautiful moment. She says she often dreams of houses, and that gardening and garden metaphors have become important to her, especially in therapy. She says, bluebells have associations both with my therapist, who first showed me what a bluebell looked like, and with my children as we make annual pilgrimages to Bluebell's woods together.
So she says this is a dream that she's had in the midst of a lot of upsetting dreams and a difficult time in her life of something blooming. And bluebells are really, really lovely. And she is looking in the dream. I'm just paying attention mostly to what the feeling tone of this dream is, and that the dream ego is in motion. She had run out of space in the back garden, so she's looking in the front, and she discovers space, but then it's not going to work, but she keeps looking, and then notices that at the point where the sunshine reached the ground, beautiful bluebells were growing. It was a lovely dream, and she received it in a difficult time. It's an encouraging dream.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's encouraging and also confirming.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a good word.
Because in the beginning of the dream, the ego is already aligned with gardening, with plants, with the earth, and that as she moves and discovers that there's this new palette to work with in the front of the house or in a different area of the psyche, that the unconscious has already begun the gardening process, that the bluebells are already blooming. To me, it suggests that the unconscious is saying, yes, it's working with her, or she's working well with the unconscious, that making things bloom, taking the natural condition and extending nature to a higher aesthetic arc by working with it and attending to it, that's a paradigm that's useful to her in terms of navigating the current outer world issues. To think of yourself as a gardener, how would you approach your life's problems right now?
Yes. And I'm also struck by the fact that in the dream, she's standing in front of the house, and it's the first time she had been round the front of the house, as usually she would enter via the back door.
Right. That's really interesting to me. That's, the sort of going through the back door versus coming through the front door. So what were you thinking about that, Deb?
Well, she goes on to say, I was excited to discover all this space at the front of the house for planting. So it picks up on your going to the gardening image, Joseph, and that go in through the front door. I'm thinking of an old camp song of, Rock of My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. And it says, you can't go under it, can't go around it. You got to go in through the door. And so here she is, standing at the front of the house. Something new is here, an entry that she has just discovered. Go in through the front door.
I think about going through the back door. There's a little bit of a sense of you're slipping in.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people go in through back doors because it's like that's the front door is sort of the official formal entrance, and the back door is kind of the casual entrance. But it also has a sense of most houses to go in through the back door is you're not obviously entering. You're kind of slipping in, kind of maybe under the radar or something. Where it has a very different feeling, the sort of striding up to the front of the house and walking straight in through the front door. There's a real kind of claiming of something to go in through the front door. It's not a half measure. You're not trying to hide what you're doing. You're really laying claim to something.
If you're overcoming a feeling of shame, then you can leave the back door, and then you can, with some sense of pride and integrity, come and ring the front doorbell or go in through the front door. I'm also feeling that the front of the house is the part that meets the neighborhood. That is the immediately visible aspect of the psyche, that it's perhaps emblematic that the dreamer may not have been attending to how she shows up in the world or how she is perceived in the world, and that cultivating how she is perceived or what she constellates in other people to even care about that is kind of an emerging area of work and interest.
Yeah, it does feel like a real claiming of self and a willingness to be seen of, that image when someone just marches right up to the front door and rings the bell or knocks on the door of, here I am. I'm visible. This is public.
Right. You're not going through the servant's entrance.
Yes. And this is not to say that in dreams or in stories, there are times when it's appropriate to go in through the back door and to be a little hidden. And if you can't get in through the front, go in through the back, a little more related to shadow, to unconscious. So there's no right or wrong to any of these things. But in this dream, there's something lovely about standing in front of the house and that it's a discovery. Because I'm excited to discover all this space at the front of the house for planting.
Yeah, there's some new territory here.
I've had several dreams in my life where I'll walk into my home, the home that I know and live in, and I'll suddenly look over and see a door that leads into several other rooms of the house that I didn't even know existed, that are full of objects. And that's always a very exciting dream and portends a very exciting expansion in the psyche.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of the planting space was in the shade or under cover. And not that this is dampening,
Well, it's dampening, but also it requires more of the ego. Because I garden and I have an older house, so there's a lot of shade, that in order for things to bloom in shade, you have to have a special kind of knowledge about how to create a shade garden. And that, yes, something is blooming naturally in the sun, the beautiful bluebells, but that there is a part of her personality which is shaded, which perhaps is more private, perhaps more introverted, perhaps doesn't receive a lot of immediate acclaim from your colleagues at work or from your friends, but still can be an area that's tended and made beautiful by determination.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think I know about bluebells, and I'm not much of a gardener, but they're wildflowers and they grow typically in the woods. So bluebells actually, I would imagine, are shade plants.
I've seen pictures of bluebells that are in a sort of sunny field. So I'm not sure, but I have a different impression that they do grow in sunny areas. And it's interesting in the dream that there's all this available planting space in shade, under cover. There's a place where it would be tricky to plant, and she thinks the area is too close to the house to plant a tree. So there's all this space that is problematic to the dream ego in some way, except this place where the sunshine actually reached the ground and bluebells were growing there. So there's some way that these are wildflowers. And maybe what comes up for me is, do you have to work that hard to plant in the shady, tricky, downward sloping, etc. kinds of places, when the wildflowers will find a sunny place and they will grow on their own? Don't have to work so hard. Dream ego's hard at work finding space to plant. And sometimes things just happen on their own. That the unconscious, as you've said so many times, Joseph, the psyche is purposive. There are bluebells here. You didn't have to work to plant them. What of the lilies of the field, as the Bible says, easy does it.
I think that's encouraging that the front of the house could be a naturalized area, so to speak. But that's really interesting because I think in most people's personalities, it's reversed, where the front of their psychological house is really where they do all their scaping, where, that's where they decide how they're going to present in their corporate grooming and how they're going to be seen by other people. And there's a lot of decisive organization. And often in the back of the house, the less conscious part will have natural things growing, or things will go to seed or be less tended. So she has an interesting kind of reversal, which I think is often present in a lot of deeply introverted people.
Yeah, I was going to say it has a feel like this image of kind of a shade garden brings up for me kind of maybe a sort of introversion or an intuitive kind of temperament, right? Because it's kind of out of the direct light of the sun. And it does tend to be an environment where, I don't know, more interesting, less perfectly landscaped, manicured things happen.
Yeah, I think there's a mystery. There's another interesting little bit about bluebells that comes to mind, that in Scotland, bluebells are called harebells because it was believed that witches would turn into hares or rabbits and hide among the flowers. So the bluebells are part of that kind of fairy kingdom, that ambivalent fairy kingdom, which goes to the ambivalence that we have about the unconscious. It's beautiful, but it's also mysterious and magical and therefore unpredictable and a place of shape changing. And in the ancient community, let's say in Scotland and Ireland, witches were highly ambivalent creatures. They were something to be respected and feared. So I wonder if there's in the midst of the beauty of the bluebells, there's also just a little ambivalence about it.
Yes, that it's maybe not even so much ambivalent as complex. It's an image that has lots of different facets, right? I mean, obviously, it's very powerful and is associated with some really powerful things in the dreamer's life. I wanted to bring up this bit about there's some of it slopes downward. So it would be tricky to plant there. And the area was too close to the house to plant a tree in case it interfered with the foundations. So one of the things that this brought up for me is the way that trees, especially in fairy tales often, can be kind of a symbol of the mother, especially when a mother has been absent or we don't have a good emotional connection with the mother for whatever reason. Sometimes a tree can almost be a kind of surrogate mother. So something about this dreamer wants to plant a tree, but is worried about what it might do to her kind of ego foundation, as it were.
It's interesting. I was thinking of this area that sloped downward toward the house also, Lisa. And I was thinking, my goodness, most of the time, the yard slopes downward toward the street because you don't want water running down into the foundation either. So that's an interesting image of the tree that would need perhaps to be planted further away from the dreamer's psychological foundations, we might imagine. And I wondered too about the introversion image of that things are sloping downward into a private area, her house, her dwelling, and that it's shady, of images perhaps of inwardness. Usually yards are our sort of social persona. You know, we have the front of the house and it looks nice and we plant shrubbery and it's landscaped and so on and so forth. It's the face we show to the world in a sense. And this is a very different yard.
It is. I'm going back to the idea of the slope and thinking about it in naturalistic terms, that if you have a house that is in some ways has sunk down, and so areas of the front yard are higher and sloping towards the foundation, that there's a risk of flooding, that most yards are carefully graded. So at least to some degree, the soil moves away from, or the water would move away from the foundation of the house. So this goes, I think, to what you're saying, Lisa, about the planting of the tree being too close. There's this risk of being overtaken or flooded or encroached upon by these various factors.
Right, including possibly some kind of archetypal content. You know, if my intuition is right that the tree might be related to a need to relate to a positive mother, that it feels, you know, like there's the possibility it could kind of inundate the ego, or it feels that way anyway.
And I think that there's, she says in the associations that she has been working in therapy and that it's been a very rich, positive experience for her. So there's also this wisdom there when she says, I looked at this area to plant the tree, and then I thought, oh, I could predict that this would interfere with the foundation. So, I'm not going to move on that.
Right.
I'm not going to do that, even though it might look nice for the first couple of years. So there's this nice predictive intelligence and wisdom that she's implementing just naturally, even in the dream state. And that's very reassuring as well.
Yeah, and an awareness that she needs to keep her foundation sturdy.
And she may need to regrade something in the personality so that some of the emotional intensity maybe flows away from her rather than getting absorbed into the foundation. And that comes into ego resilience.
Yes.
That, I don't have to let everything that people say to me to flow right into the foundation of my personality. Maybe it'll just hit the persona and just, roll back down to the street and then, down the road, so that there's a little more selective process there.
Oh, I agree with what you've said. It resonates for me. And the telos, or the prospective function of this dream, is at the point where the sunshine actually reached the ground, some beautiful bluebells were growing. We've been talking about precognitive dreams, and Jung calls them prospective dreams. And here's a lovely example of that in a dream of there's a place where the sunshine reaches the ground and bluebells are growing.
And it's a delightful discovery that she didn't anticipate.
Yes.
It looked like there was a big onerous process. I have to say, planting an entire, front yard, it's a lot of labor. You have to really roll up your sleeves, much like starting therapy. You suddenly discover this, area of the psyche you're responsible for. And, there's all of these decisions and labor at, conditioning the soil and weeding and planting and then, of course, tending everything you plant so that it doesn't wither and die. So she's got what might be a sober assessment of this new piece of work in the front of the yard. And just at the point when she might be feeling overwhelmed with how this is going to work out, there's just this little bit of hope. This is fertile soil, and something beautiful is here and can be advanced, can be multiplied, perhaps.
I'm thinking of Jung's dream about, if I'm remembering this correctly, of a huge stone next to which a small white flower bloomed. And here are her bluebells.
Well, perhaps with that message of hope and light, we can draw to a close.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.